The Riverside County Courthouse's family court chamber falls into stunned silence as a woman in a modest business suit rises from the gallery, flanked by federal agents displaying FBI credentials and Department of Justice identification. Judge Martin Crawford's arrogant expression crumbles as he recognizes the black woman he just humiliated and denied custody to 30 minutes earlier during what he assumed was a routine divorce proceeding. "Your Honor," Director Vanessa Price announces, her voice carrying unmistakable federal authority throughout the courtroom. "I'm Director Vanessa Price, FBI Civil Rights Division. Some of you may not recognize me without my official credentials, as I've been operating under the identity Keisha Johnson while investigating systematic judicial bias in family court proceedings." Her eyes lock onto Crawford, who's gone pale. "Judge Crawford, I believe we need to discuss why you denied me custody of my fictional daughter, stated that women like me typically make poor parenting choices, and suggested that my ex-husband would provide a more stable, traditional family environment despite documented evidence of his domestic violence history." The courtroom freezes in recognition. The judge who 30 minutes ago had wielded absolute authority over families' futures now faces the FBI director whose investigation will end his judicial career. And federal arrest warrants are already being prepared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, FBI Director Vanessa Price had received the most troubling civil rights complaint of her 8-year tenure leading the Bureau's Civil Rights Division. At 42, Price had built her career on exposing institutional discrimination in systems where victims lacked resources to challenge abuse of authority, from police departments that protected killer cops to school districts that criminalized black children. But the complaint about Judge Martin Crawford represented something uniquely dangerous: systematic judicial bias that weaponized family courts to destroy black families while hiding behind the veneer of child welfare and legal process. The documentation came from attorney Lisa Chong, a family law specialist who had been tracking disturbing patterns in Crawford's custody decisions over 18 months. Chang's research showed that Crawford awarded custody to white fathers in 87% of contested cases involving black mothers, compared to 23% for white mothers in identical circumstances. Disparities so extreme they suggested intentional discrimination rather than unconscious bias. More troubling were Crawford's written opinions, which consistently characterized black mothers as unstable, unsuitable, or lacking appropriate family values, while describing white fathers as providing traditional stability and proper role modeling, language that revealed racial stereotyping disguised as judicial reasoning. Chang's complaint included transcripts where Crawford had questioned black mothers about their lifestyle choices, demanded extensive documentation of employment and housing that he never required from white parents, and imposed supervision requirements that assumed incompetence rather than protecting children's welfare. Judge Crawford isn't just biased, Chong had written in her complaint to the FBI. He's systematically using family court to enforce racial hierarchy by separating black children from their mothers and awarding custody to white fathers regardless of fitness or circumstances. Children are being traumatized and families destroyed to serve Crawford's personal prejudices about race and parenting. The statistical evidence was overwhelming, but Price knew that proving discriminatory intent in judicial settings required more than disparate outcomes. Federal prosecution of judges demanded evidence that bias was conscious and systematic rather than merely the result of poor judgment or unconscious prejudice. Judge Martin Crawford had presided over Riverside County Family Court for 12 years, building a reputation for no-nonsense decisions that prioritized child welfare over political correctness, coded language that family law attorneys recognized as hostility toward diversity and progressive parenting approaches. Crawford's background revealed concerning patterns that judicial oversight had ignored. He had been disciplined twice for inappropriate comments about minority families during proceedings, censured once for insensitive language regarding single mothers, and faced multiple appeals of custody decisions that showed clear racial bias. But Crawford's institutional protection came from political connections and ideological alignment with conservative judicial philosophy that framed discrimination as traditional values and bias as principled decision-making. His supporters viewed challenges to his rulings as attacks on judicial independence rather than legitimate civil rights concerns. Price's investigation had been complicated by Crawford's skill at using legal language to disguise racial motivation. His written opinions avoided explicitly racist statements while consistently applying different standards based on racial assumptions about parenting, stability, and family structure. The breakthrough had come when Nancy Stevens, Crawford's court clerk for 8 years, contacted the FBI with internal documentation showing the judge's private communications about cases involving black families. Stevens had been troubled by Crawford's behavior for years, but lacked protection from retaliation until federal whistleblower policies were strengthened. He calls black mothers welfare queens and baby mamas in chambers, Stevens had told FBI investigators. He jokes about saving children from ghetto culture and giving them chance at real families. He decides custody based on race before hearing evidence, then constructs legal justifications afterward. Her testimony provided direct evidence of discriminatory intent that transformed statistical patterns into federal crimes. But Price needed to witness Crawford's bias personally to understand how it operated and build prosecutable cases that would survive legal challenges. The undercover operation required creating comprehensive false identity as Keisha Johnson, a divorced professional seeking custody of her 8-year-old daughter from her white ex-husband, James Johnson. The fictional case was designed to trigger Crawford's documented biases while providing opportunity to record his discriminatory statements and reasoning. Price's cover identity was meticulously constructed: employment history as a marketing coordinator, residential address in a predominantly black neighborhood, educational background at a state university, and financial records showing middle-class stability that should have supported custody claims under any objective analysis. The fictional ex-husband was portrayed as having documented domestic violence history, employment instability, and substance abuse issues that would typically disqualify him from custody consideration. The case was designed to be clear-cut in favor of the mother under any non-discriminatory analysis. Assistant Director Thomas Reed coordinated the federal response team that would document Crawford behavior while maintaining Price's operational security. The team included DOJ civil rights attorneys, federal marshals, and technical specialists who would record proceedings and prepare evidence for prosecution. We're not just investigating one judge's bias, Reed had briefed the team. We're documenting how judicial discrimination operates systematically to destroy black families while appearing to serve child welfare. This case will establish precedent for federal prosecution of discriminatory judges nationwide. Price's approach emphasized patience and professionalism despite the personal difficulty of subjecting herself to racism for investigative purposes. Her experience with undercover work had taught her that authentic reactions to discrimination provided more compelling evidence than theatrical confrontation. As Price had prepared for the custody hearing that would expose Crawford's bias, she reflected on the families whose lives had been destroyed by his discrimination and the children who had been separated from loving mothers to serve judicial racism disguised as legal process. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Director Vanessa Price entered Riverside County Courthouse at 8:30 a.m. wearing the carefully chosen attire of her Keisha Johnson cover identity: professional but not expensive, appropriate but not privileged. Her 18 years of federal law enforcement had taught her that successful undercover work required authentic detail in everything from clothing choices to body language that reflected the assumed identity's social position. Family Court's waiting area was filled with parents, attorneys, and children whose lives would be determined by judicial decisions that should prioritize child welfare over personal prejudice. Price observed the environment with both maternal protective instincts and investigative assessment, understanding that Crawford's courtroom represented systematic threat to countless families. Judge Martin Crawford's chambers overlooked the courthouse parking lot from the third floor, his position providing literal and symbolic elevation over the community members whose families he controlled. At 57, Crawford had spent 12 years wielding family court authority with minimal oversight and maximum discretion, a combination that enabled discrimination while protecting it through judicial immunity. Price's fictional case was scheduled for 9:15 a.m., strategically positioned to allow Crawford's morning routine to establish his typical demeanor before encountering what he would perceive as routine custody dispute between a black mother and white father. Attorney Carlos Vega, assigned as Price's legal representation, had been briefed on the undercover operation's general parameters without knowing his client's actual identity. His role was to present competent advocacy while allowing Crawford's bias to emerge naturally rather than being suppressed by exceptional legal maneuvering. Ms. Johnson, Vega addressed Price in the courthouse hallway. Your case should be straightforward based on the evidence we've compiled. Your ex-husband's documented domestic violence and substance abuse history clearly support your custody petition. His professional assessment was accurate under any objective analysis. Price's fictional persona was employed, stable, and without negative factors that would justify denying custody, while the ex-husband's record included multiple concerning elements that should disqualify him from custodial responsibility. Judge Crawford entered his courtroom at precisely 9 a.m., his judicial robes conveying authority that he had learned to use for personal agenda rather than legal justice. His expression as he surveyed the morning's docket showed the casual confidence of someone accustomed to unchallenged power over vulnerable families. Case number 2024 FC 1847, Johnson v. Johnson, custody determination. Court Clerk Nancy Stevens announced, her voice betraying none of the anxiety she felt about witnessing another example of Crawford's discriminatory decision-making. Price approached the petitioner's table with the respectful deference that family court demanded, understanding that Crawford's bias would be triggered by her presence regardless of her demeanor or qualifications. Attorney Richard Hayes, representing the fictional ex-husband, had been selected specifically because his previous cases with Crawford showed pattern of success when his clients were white men seeking custody from black mothers, success rates that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Crawford's initial assessment of Price was immediately visible. His expression shifted from judicial neutrality to skeptical scrutiny as he processed her appearance and made automatic assumptions about her character, competence, and worthiness as a parent. Ms. Johnson, Crawford began, his tone carrying subtle condescension that would escalate throughout the proceeding. I see you're seeking primary custody of your 8-year-old daughter. What makes you believe you're the appropriate custodial parent in this situation? The question was problematic from the start, placing burden on Price to justify her fitness rather than evaluating both parents objectively based on evidence and circumstances. Your Honor, I've been Emma's primary caregiver since birth, Price replied, using information from her carefully constructed case file. I have stable employment, appropriate housing, and no history of legal or personal problems that would affect my parenting ability. Her response was factually accurate and professionally delivered, providing foundation for custody award under any neutral analysis. But Crawford's reaction demonstrated the bias that Attorney Chang's complaint had documented. Rather than acknowledging Price's qualifications, he immediately shifted to interrogation that revealed his preconceptions about black mothers and family stability. Ms. Johnson, I see you live in the Eastbrook neighborhood. Are you concerned about exposing your daughter to the influences and activities common in that area? The geographic profiling was thinly disguised racial coding. Eastbrook was predominantly black, and Crawford's characterization of influences and activities perpetuated stereotypes about black communities being inherently dangerous for children. Price maintained composure while recognizing that Crawford's questioning revealed exactly the discriminatory mindset that federal prosecution would target. Your Honor, Eastbrook is a stable residential neighborhood with good schools and community resources. Emma has friends and activities there that support her development. Crawford's expression showed irritation at Price's failure to accept his characterization of her neighborhood as problematic. In his worldview, Black mothers should acknowledge their community's supposed deficiencies rather than defending environments he had predetermined were unsuitable. I see, Crawford replied dismissively. And what about your employment situation? Court records show you work as a marketing coordinator. Is that sufficient to provide the kind of stable environment a child needs? The employment questioning revealed additional bias. Crawford routinely accepted white mothers' professional positions without scrutiny while demanding Black mothers justify their ability to support children despite comparable or superior qualifications. Attorney Vega intervened appropriately. Your Honor, Ms. Johnson has steady employment with benefits and has consistently provided for Emma's needs without any financial assistance or support issues. But Crawford's attention had already shifted to Hayes, his demeanor becoming noticeably more respectful and collaborative when addressing the white male attorney representing the ex-husband. Mr. Hayes, what's your client's position regarding custody arrangements? The difference in tone was immediately apparent. Courteous inquiry rather than skeptical interrogation, presumption of legitimacy rather than assumption of inadequacy. The custody hearing's trajectory became clear as Judge Crawford systematically applied different standards to identical evidence based solely on the racial dynamics he perceived between Keisha Johnson and her fictional ex-husband. Attorney Hayes presented his case with confidence that suggested coordination rather than coincidence with Crawford's obvious bias. Your Honor, my client James Johnson is deeply concerned about his daughter's welfare and believes he can provide the stable, traditional family environment that Emma needs during this crucial developmental period. Hayes began, using language that appeared neutral but carried coded racial messaging about appropriate family structures. Crawford's body language immediately became more attentive and receptive, leaning forward with interest that contrasted sharply with his dismissive posture during Price's testimony. Mr. Hayes, please elaborate on your client's concerns about the current custody arrangement, Crawford requested, his tone suggesting collaborative investigation rather than judicial neutrality. Hayes continued with practiced efficiency. Your Honor, Mr. Johnson works as a project manager with a Fortune 500 company, owns his home in the prestigious Riverside Heights neighborhood, and can provide educational and social opportunities that will prepare Emma for success in competitive environments. Each element of Hayes' presentation was designed to contrast with stereotypical assumptions about Black mothers. Corporate employment versus uncertain work, property ownership versus rental housing, prestigious neighborhoods versus problematic areas. Price observed Crawford's reactions with investigative precision, noting how his questions became supportive rather than confrontational when addressing white male authority and conventional socioeconomic status. And what specific concerns does your client have about Ms. Johnson's parenting? Crawford asked, his phrasing suggesting that concerns were presumptively valid rather than requiring substantiation. Hayes produced documentation that should have been legally irrelevant but served Crawford's discriminatory agenda. Your Honor, Mr. Johnson is concerned about Emma's exposure to certain cultural influences and social environments that may not prepare her for mainstream success. The cultural influences language was explicitly racial without using specific terminology that would create grounds for appeal, a technique that Crawford had perfected for avoiding judicial review while implementing personal prejudices. Attorney Vega objected appropriately. Your Honor, Mr. Johnson's documented domestic violence history and substance abuse issues are directly relevant to custody determination, while vague references to cultural influences appear to target Ms. Johnson's race rather than her parenting capabilities. Crawford's irritation at the objection was immediate and visible. Mr. Vega, this court considers all factors relevant to child welfare, including environmental and social influences that affect development. Your client's residential choices and lifestyle decisions are appropriate areas for judicial review. His ruling that racial profiling constituted legitimate judicial inquiry demonstrated exactly the bias that Price's investigation was designed to document and prosecute. Hayes continued with increasing boldness. Your Honor, Emma has expressed to the court-appointed psychologist that she feels more comfortable and secure in her father's home environment. She's mentioned feeling anxious about certain aspects of her mother's neighborhood and social circle. The fabricated child testimony was particularly egregious because it weaponized Emma's supposed preferences to validate adult racial prejudices, a tactic that Crawford had used repeatedly to justify custody transfers from black mothers to white fathers. Price maintained her Keisha Johnson persona while internally cataloging each discriminatory element for federal prosecution. The geographic profiling, the cultural stereotyping, the fabricated child testimony, and Crawford's obvious collaboration with Hayes to construct legally acceptable justifications for racially motivated decisions. Your Honor, Vega attempted to counter. Ms. Johnson has been Emma's primary caregiver for 8 years with no documented problems. The psychological evaluation shows a strong, healthy bond between mother and daughter. Mr. Johnson's history of domestic violence and alcohol abuse creates legitimate safety concerns that outweigh any speculative advantages of different neighborhoods or schools. Crawford's response revealed the futility of evidence-based argument against predetermined racial conclusions. Mr. Vega, while domestic violence allegations are serious, people can change and grow. Mr. Johnson has completed anger management and substance abuse programs, demonstrating commitment to personal improvement. The court must consider current circumstances rather than past mistakes. The double standard was blatant. Black mothers faced permanent judgment for any imperfection, while white fathers received credit for minimal efforts to address serious behavioral problems. Court reporter Linda Thompson documented every word with professional neutrality, but her expression showed recognition that she was witnessing systematic judicial misconduct that violated basic principles of equal treatment and child welfare. Nancy Stevens, the court clerk who had provided crucial evidence for Price's investigation, watched Crawford's performance with familiar disgust, understanding that another black family was being destroyed by judicial racism disguised as legal process. Price recognized that Crawford's bias had reached the threshold for federal intervention. His statements and reasoning provided clear evidence of discriminatory intent that would support prosecution under civil rights statutes protecting citizens from judicial abuse of authority. As the hearing approached its predetermined conclusion, custody transfer from black mother to white father despite overwhelming evidence supporting the opposite outcome. Price prepared for the moment when her federal authority would transform victim into prosecutor and expose Crawford's systematic discrimination to accountability that his judicial immunity couldn't protect him from. The judge who thought his robes made him untouchable was about to discover that federal civil rights enforcement operated under different rules than state judicial politics, and that his discrimination against FBI leadership would trigger consequences that would end his career and potentially his freedom. While Judge Crawford systematically demolished Keisha Johnson's custody case through racially motivated reasoning, FBI headquarters was coordinating a comprehensive federal response that would converge on Riverside County Courthouse with authority that transcended local judicial immunity and state court politics. Assistant Director Thomas Reed monitored Price's undercover operation from the FBI's Civil Rights Division Command Center, where technical specialists tracked audio and video feeds from her concealed recording devices, while legal analysts prepared documentation for immediate federal intervention. Director Price's cover is holding perfectly, Reed reported to Deputy Attorney General Patricia Williams via secure communication. Crawford is demonstrating exactly the discriminatory behavior that our investigation predicted. His bias is so blatant that prosecution will be straightforward once we reveal the federal law enforcement targeting. Williams had been briefed on the operation's significance for establishing precedent about federal authority over discriminatory state judges. Tom, this case will determine whether judicial immunity protects judges who systematically violate civil rights or whether federal prosecution can hold them accountable like any other government official who abuses authority. The legal implications extended far beyond Crawford's individual misconduct to fundamental questions about judicial accountability and federal enforcement of constitutional protections in state court systems. DOJ Civil Rights Attorney Michelle Barnes had been analyzing Crawford's recorded statements in real time comparing his language to federal statutes governing deprivation of rights under color of law that applied to all government officials, including judges who violated constitutional protections. Crawford's statements about cultural influences and traditional family environments constitute clear evidence of racial discrimination in custody determination, Barnes reported. His systematic application of different standards based on race violates both Equal Protection Clause and federal civil rights statutes. Federal Marshal Jennifer Cole was coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure Price's safety during the undercover operation while preparing for immediate arrest authority once Crawford's discrimination was fully documented. Meanwhile, Nancy Stevens had been providing crucial inside information about Crawford's patterns of discrimination and his methods for avoiding administrative oversight through careful language and political protection. Judge Crawford has been doing this for years, Stevens told FBI investigators during secure debriefing. He tells white Father's attorneys exactly how to present their cases to get favorable rulings, while creating impossible standards for black mothers that ensure they lose custody regardless of their qualifications. Her testimony provided evidence of systematic conspiracy between Crawford and certain attorneys to manipulate family court outcomes based on racial preferences rather than child welfare considerations. Attorney Lisa Chong had been coordinating with other family law specialists to document the broader scope of Crawford's discriminatory impact, identifying dozens of cases where custody decisions appeared motivated by racial bias rather than evidence or legal standards. We've identified 37 cases over 18 months where Crawford awarded custody to white fathers despite documented domestic violence, substance abuse, or unemployment while denying custody to black mothers with clean records and stable employment, Chong reported to federal investigators. The statistical evidence provided foundation for federal prosecution under pattern or practice statutes that addressed systematic violations rather than isolated incidents. Reverend Paul Jackson, who led community advocacy for families affected by judicial discrimination, had been monitoring Crawford's courtroom through court observers who documented disparities in treatment that suggested institutional racism. Families in our community have been reporting Crawford's bias for years, Jackson told federal investigators. Black mothers consistently lose custody to white fathers regardless of circumstances. Children are being traumatized and families destroyed to serve one judge's racial prejudices. Inspector General Robert Kim was conducting parallel investigation of state judicial oversight mechanisms that had failed to identify or address Crawford's systematic discrimination despite clear statistical evidence and multiple complaints. The State Judicial Conduct Board received 17 complaints about Crawford's racial bias over 3 years, Kim reported. Each was dismissed without meaningful investigation, suggesting institutional protection rather than accountability for discriminatory judges. Dr. Angela Torres, the child psychologist who had been assigned to evaluate families in Crawford's courtroom, contacted federal investigators with concerns about pressure to provide testimony that supported predetermined custody outcomes rather than objective assessment of family dynamics. Judge Crawford makes it clear what conclusions he wants before I complete evaluations, Torres told FBI agents. When I provide assessments that contradict his racial assumptions, he dismisses them or finds other psychologists who will support his preferred outcomes. Her testimony revealed how Crawford manipulated professional expertise to provide scientific veneer for racially motivated decisions, corrupting child welfare systems to serve personal prejudices. As federal agencies documented Crawford's systematic discrimination and prepared for immediate intervention, the judge continued his custody hearing with complete confidence that his judicial authority protected him from accountability for decisions that destroyed black families while serving white supremacist ideology. He had no idea that within minutes, his courtroom would be occupied by federal agents with arrest warrants, that his victim was actually the FBI director whose authority exceeded his local judicial jurisdiction, or that his systematic discrimination had been documented for federal prosecution that would end his career and expose judicial racism to public accountability. Director Vanessa Price sat in Judge Crawford's courtroom, maintaining her Keisha Johnson cover while internally shifting to federal law enforcement mode as Crawford's discriminatory custody decision approached its inevitable conclusion. Her secure communication device vibrated with coded message from Assistant Director Reed. Federal team, in position. Authorization granted for immediate revelation and intervention. Crawford had spent 45 minutes systematically applying different standards to identical evidence, creating legal justifications for awarding custody to a white father with documented domestic violence history, while denying it to a black mother with exemplary record. His bias was so transparent that even attorneys in the gallery showed visible discomfort with the proceedings. Ms. Johnson, Crawford announced with the satisfied authority of someone confident in his untouchable position, while you clearly care about your daughter's welfare, the court finds that Mr. Johnson can provide the stable, traditional environment that Emma needs for optimal development. Primary custody is awarded to the father, with supervised visitation for the mother every other weekend. The devastating ruling would have destroyed a real family, but Price understood its value as evidence of systematic judicial discrimination that federal prosecution would use to establish precedent for holding biased judges accountable. Attorney Vega objected with appropriate outrage. Your Honor, this decision contradicts overwhelming evidence favoring Ms. Johnson and ignores documented safety concerns about Mr. Johnson. I request immediate appeal and stay of this ruling pending review. Crawford's dismissive response revealed his confidence in institutional protection. Mr. Vega, this court's decisions are based on comprehensive analysis of child welfare factors. Your client's disagreement with the outcome doesn't constitute grounds for appeal. The custody transfer will proceed as ordered. His arrogance would prove catastrophically misplaced within minutes. Price activated her emergency communication protocol, sending coded signal that triggered immediate federal response, while maintaining her emotional cover as devastated mother whose child was being taken through judicial racism. Your Honor, Price said, rising from her seat with careful composure, I believe there are federal authorities who need to review this proceeding before any custody transfer occurs. Crawford's irritation at what he perceived as desperate stalling tactic was immediate. Ms. Johnson, this court's authority is final regarding custody determination. Federal authorities have no jurisdiction over state family court decisions, and your threats about outside intervention are inappropriate and potentially contemptuous. His lecture about jurisdictional limits would be proven completely wrong within moments. The courtroom doors opened as federal agents entered with credentials and documentation that immediately commanded attention from bailiffs and court personnel who recognized genuine federal authority when they saw it. Assistant Director Reed approached the bench with formal notification. Judge Crawford, this proceeding is suspended pending federal investigation of civil rights violations in custody determination. Please direct all parties to remain in position while we address jurisdictional concerns. Crawford's confusion was evident as he processed unexpected federal presence in his courtroom. Agent Reed, I don't understand the federal interest in routine state family court proceedings. This is highly irregular and potentially disruptive to legitimate judicial processes. His assumption that federal agents were overstepping boundaries revealed complete ignorance of how civil rights enforcement operated when government officials violated constitutional protections. DOJ Attorney Barnes stepped forward with legal documentation. Judge Crawford, we're investigating systematic discrimination in custody proceedings based on race. This hearing is being reviewed as part of federal civil rights enforcement under Section 1983 and related statutes governing deprivation of rights under color of law. The specific mention of federal civil rights statutes should have prompted Crawford to reconsider his position, but his judicial arrogance prevented recognition that he was facing serious legal jeopardy. This is prosecutorial overreach, Crawford replied defensively. Family court judges have broad discretion in custody determination, and my decisions are based on child welfare considerations rather than racial factors. Federal authorities have no business interfering with legitimate judicial proceedings. His denial of racial motivation was contradicted by 45 minutes of recorded discriminatory statements and reasoning that federal prosecutors would use to establish intent beyond reasonable doubt. Price stood from the petitioner's table, her posture shifting subtly from deferent parent to federal law enforcement authority as she prepared to reveal her actual identity and transform victim into prosecutor. "Judge Crawford," Price said, her voice carrying unmistakable command presence that made everyone in the courtroom unconsciously straighten. "Before we continue, I should clarify something about my identity and the authority available to address your systematic discrimination against black families." Crawford's expression showed dawning concern as Price's tone and bearing suggested authority that contradicted his assumptions about her powerlessness and his protection from accountability. Federal Marshal Cole positioned herself strategically near Crawford's bench while additional agents secured the courtroom exits, their professional movements indicating that routine judicial proceeding was transforming into federal law enforcement operation. Nancy Stevens, the court clerk who had provided crucial evidence for Price's investigation, watched with satisfaction as Crawford's institutional protection began crumbling under federal scrutiny that his local political connections couldn't influence or control. The judge who had weaponized family court to enforce racial hierarchy was about to discover that his victims included someone with federal authority to ensure that judicial discrimination faced the same criminal consequences as any other civil rights violation committed under color of law. The Riverside County Family Courtroom became the epicenter of a power reversal that would redefine judicial accountability and demonstrate that no government official, regardless of position or institutional protection, was immune from federal civil rights enforcement when they systematically violated constitutional protections. "Judge Martin Crawford," Director Price announced, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement throughout the stunned courtroom. "I am Director Vanessa Price, FBI Civil Rights Division. For the past 3 weeks, I have been operating under the cover identity Keisha Johnson to investigate systematic racial discrimination in your custody proceedings." Crawford's face showed complete shock as he processed that the black woman he had spent 45 minutes humiliating and denying custody to was actually the FBI director whose authority far exceeded his judicial jurisdiction. "This is impossible," Crawford stammered, his judicial composure collapsing as the implications of his actions became clear. Federal law enforcement cannot conduct undercover operations targeting sitting judges without proper notification through judicial channels. His desperation to find procedural protection revealed complete failure to understand that civil rights violations by government officials triggered federal jurisdiction regardless of their position or institutional claims to immunity. Assistant Director Reed stepped forward with formal documentation. "Judge Crawford, Director Price's investigation was authorized at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Your systematic discrimination against black families in custody proceedings violates federal civil rights statutes that apply to all government officials, including judges who abuse their authority. The constitutional framework made clear that judicial immunity protected judges from lawsuits regarding their decisions, but provided no protection from criminal prosecution when those decisions violated citizens' civil rights through discriminatory intent." Attorney Barnes displayed federal charges on her tablet. "Judge Crawford, you are under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and systematic discrimination in the administration of justice. Your recorded statements during today's proceeding provide clear evidence of intentional racial bias in custody determination." Court reporter Linda Thompson, who had been documenting the proceedings with growing recognition that she was witnessing federal crimes, looked relieved that accountability was finally arriving for discrimination she had been forced to transcribe for years. "Your Honor," Attorney Vegas said with satisfaction, "I believe federal jurisdiction supersedes your custody ruling." Ms. Johnson, Director Price's fictional case demonstrates exactly the discriminatory patterns that my real clients have been reporting for years. Crawford attempted one final assertion of judicial authority. "This is entrapment and prosecutorial misconduct. I made legitimate judicial decisions based on child welfare considerations. If my reasoning appears problematic in retrospect, that reflects the complexity of custody determination not criminal intent. Director Price's response eliminated any possibility of hiding behind judicial discretion. Judge Crawford, your own words during this proceeding included characterizing my fictional neighborhood as inherently problematic for children, questioning my employment adequacy despite stable income, and accepting fabricated testimony about cultural influences that was explicitly racial. You systematically applied different standards based on race while collaborating with Attorney Hayes to construct legal justifications for predetermined discriminatory outcomes. The precise recitation of his discriminatory statements and reasoning made denial impossible and demonstrated that federal law enforcement had documented every element necessary for successful prosecution. Nancy Stevens, the court clerk whose whistleblower testimony had been crucial for the investigation, stood to provide additional evidence. Director Price, I have 8 years of internal documentation showing Judge Crawford's patterns of discrimination, including his private statements about black families and his coordination with certain attorneys to ensure custody outcomes that reflect his racial preferences rather than child welfare. Her courage in exposing institutional misconduct despite personal risk demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity that made federal civil rights enforcement possible when local oversight mechanisms failed. Federal Marshal Cole approached Crawford with arrest warrant and restraints. Judge Crawford, you are under federal arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court proceedings. The sight of a sitting judge being handcuffed in his own courtroom sent shockwaves through legal personnel who had assumed judicial position provided immunity from accountability for discriminatory behavior. Reverend Paul Jackson, who had been observing from the gallery as part of his advocacy for affected families, stood to address the federal agents. Director Price, this community has been waiting years for someone with authority to address Judge Crawford's systematic destruction of black families. Thank you for ensuring that judicial racism faces the same consequences as any other civil rights violation. Crawford made one final attempt to minimize his culpability. Director Price, if my decision showed patterns that appear discriminatory, that reflects unconscious bias rather than intentional discrimination. Judicial training on implicit bias could address these concerns without criminal prosecution that destroys careers over what amounts to professional development issues. Price's response was definitive. Judge Crawford, your discrimination was conscious and systematic. You coordinated with attorneys to ensure racially motivated outcomes, manipulated child welfare evaluations to support predetermined conclusions, and used judicial authority to enforce personal racial hierarchy. This wasn't unconscious bias. This was deliberate civil rights violation that federal law treats as seriously as any other government official's abuse of authority. As federal agents escorted Crawford from his courtroom in handcuffs, the transformation was complete. The judge who had wielded absolute power over families' futures now faced federal prosecution under the authority of someone whose commitment to civil rights exceeded his local judicial politics and institutional protection. The morning following Judge Crawford's arrest, Director Price convened a comprehensive federal accountability conference at the Riverside County Courthouse, ensuring that the response to systematic judicial discrimination would be public, transparent, and comprehensive rather than handled through closed federal proceedings that might minimize the institutional impact. The courthouse's main auditorium was packed with attorneys, families affected by Crawford's discrimination, community leaders, and media covering what had become a landmark case for federal prosecution of discriminatory judges. Yesterday, this federal investigation exposed systematic racial discrimination in family court proceedings that violated the constitutional rights of black families while traumatizing children to serve judicial prejudice. Price began addressing an audience that included State Attorney General Patricia Williams and federal judicial oversight officials. Judge Crawford's actions represent institutional failure at multiple levels. Not just individual bias, but systematic protection of discriminatory behavior that enabled years of civil rights violations. State Attorney General Williams acknowledged the severity of institutional problems. Director Price, the state deeply regrets that judicial oversight mechanisms failed to identify and address Judge Crawford's systematic discrimination despite clear statistical evidence and multiple complaints. We're committed to comprehensive reform, ensuring judicial accountability and constitutional compliance. Her statement represented recognition that state oversight had protected rather than prevented discrimination, requiring federal intervention to restore constitutional compliance. Chief Judge Patricia Morrison of the State Court of Appeals announced immediate judicial reforms. Effective today, Judge Crawford is permanently removed from all judicial duties. We're implementing mandatory bias training for all family court judges, demographic tracking of custody decisions, and federal oversight of any judge showing statistical disparities in outcomes based on race. The swift institutional response demonstrated recognition that protecting discriminatory judges would trigger comprehensive federal oversight that could destroy local judicial autonomy. Attorney Lisa Chong, whose initial complaint had triggered Price's investigation, addressed the federal officials. "We appreciate swift accountability, but families in this community have been reporting Judge Crawford's discrimination for years while being dismissed by judicial oversight that prioritized protecting judges over protecting civil rights. What systematic changes will prevent future discrimination rather than just responding to it after damage is done?" Her challenge forced authorities to address whether reforms would be comprehensive or merely reactive to public attention. Reverend Paul Jackson, representing affected families, provided community perspective. 37 families have had their children removed through Judge Crawford's racial bias over 18 months. These children have been traumatized by forced separation from loving mothers to serve one judge's personal prejudices. Individual accountability matters, but family reunification and community healing matter more. His testimony expanded accountability beyond criminal prosecution to restoration for victims whose lives had been destroyed by systematic discrimination. DOJ Civil Rights Attorney Barnes announced comprehensive federal investigation. "We're reviewing every custody case Judge Crawford decided over his 12-year tenure, with particular attention to cases involving Black families. Any decisions showing evidence of racial bias will be overturned. Families will be reunified, and affected parties will receive federal compensation for civil rights violations." The comprehensive review demonstrated federal commitment to addressing systematic harm rather than just punishing individual perpetrators. Nancy Stevens, the court clerk whose whistleblower testimony had been crucial for the investigation, was publicly recognized for her courage. Ms. Stevens risked her career to expose judicial corruption and protect civil rights. Her integrity made federal prosecution possible and will be rewarded through witness protection and advancement opportunities within federal judicial administration. The public recognition encouraged other government employees to report misconduct rather than protecting institutional comfort through silence. Dr. Angela Torres, the child psychologist who had been pressured to provide biased evaluations, testified about professional coercion. Judge Crawford demanded psychological assessments that supported his racial assumptions rather than objective evaluation of family dynamics. "When I provided honest assessments that contradicted his prejudices, he threatened to remove me from court appointment lists that provided significant income." Her testimony revealed how Crawford had corrupted professional expertise to provide scientific veneer for discriminatory decisions. Federal oversight mechanisms were announced that would monitor judicial decision-making for discriminatory patterns. Quarterly demographic analysis of all custody decisions, automatic federal review triggered by racial disparities exceeding 10%, and anonymous reporting systems for attorneys and families to flag potentially biased proceedings. Inspector General Kim outlined broader judicial accountability measures. "We're expanding this investigation to review family court systems nationwide for similar patterns of discrimination. Any jurisdiction showing statistical evidence of racial bias in custody proceedings will face federal oversight and potential prosecution of responsible judges." The Accountability Conference concluded with concrete structural changes: federal monitoring for 5 years, mandatory constitutional compliance training for all judges, revised evaluation criteria that weighted civil rights protection equally with case management efficiency, and civilian oversight with authority to investigate discriminatory patterns. Federal prosecution of Crawford proceeded with charges carrying potential 20-year sentence, the most severe penalty ever sought for judicial civil rights violations, establishing precedent that discriminatory judges faced consequences equivalent to other government officials who abused authority. Judge Crawford's systematic discrimination destroyed families and traumatized children to serve personal racial prejudices, federal prosecutor Michael Thompson stated. His abuse of judicial authority demands severe consequences that deter other judges from similar violations. As the accountability process concluded, families who had lost custody through Crawford's discrimination approached Price to express gratitude for federal intervention that local oversight had failed to provide. "Thank you for proving that even judges face consequences when they violate civil rights," one reunited mother told Price. "We knew Crawford was wrong, but nobody with authority listened until you showed that federal law applies to everyone." Over the following 10 weeks, the Riverside County Family Court system underwent the most comprehensive transformation in its history, implementing changes that would serve as a national model for eliminating judicial discrimination while maintaining effective child welfare protection through constitutional means. The Federal Judicial Oversight Commission, established under Department of Justice authority, was directed by retired federal judge Dr. Patricia Chun, whose expertise in civil rights law and family court administration made her uniquely qualified to rebuild state judicial systems that had systematically failed to protect constitutional rights. "We're not just removing biased judges," Dr. Chun explained during mandatory training attended by all 43 family court judges in the district. "We're building accountability systems that make discrimination organizationally impossible to sustain. Every custody decision, every evaluation, every ruling will be tracked, reviewed, and analyzed for constitutional compliance and child welfare effectiveness." The training emphasized data-driven decision-making rather than subjective judgment, using statistical analysis of Crawford's cases to demonstrate how bias undermined both civil rights and child welfare by separating children from qualified parents based on racial prejudice rather than evidence. Chief Judge Morrison implemented revolutionary accountability measures throughout the family court system. Every judge's custody decisions were now tracked demographically, with quarterly reports showing award rates by racial category, income level, and geographic location. Any judge showing disparities exceeding 15% between demographic groups faced mandatory review, additional training, and potential removal. "Transparency protects everyone," Morrison explained to the Judicial Conference. "When decisions are tracked and audited, unconscious bias gets corrected quickly. When patterns emerge that suggest discrimination, we address them through accountability rather than protection." The statistical monitoring eliminated judicial immunity as protection for discriminatory behavior, making clear that constitutional compliance was measurable rather than subjective. Director Price worked with Department of Justice civil rights experts to develop the Riverside Protocol, comprehensive procedures for identifying and addressing judicial discrimination before it escalated to systematic family destruction that required federal prosecution. Family courts wield enormous power over children's lives and family relationships, Price explained during her congressional testimony about judicial accountability. When judges abuse that power through racial discrimination, they don't just violate civil rights. They traumatize children and destroy families to serve personal prejudices. Federal oversight isn't interference with judicial independence. It's protection of constitutional rights that judicial independence exists to serve. Her framework elevated civil rights protection from administrative concern to constitutional imperative that superseded local judicial politics and institutional self-protection. The Family Justice Commission, established with authority independent of judicial administration, included affected parents, child welfare experts, civil rights attorneys, and community representatives with power to investigate discriminatory patterns, review controversial custody decisions, and recommend judicial discipline, including removal for constitutional violations. Attorney Chong, promoted to commission director, provided crucial perspective about how discrimination operated in family court settings. Judicial bias doesn't usually involve explicitly racist statements. It operates through different standards, different questions, different assumptions about parenting based on race rather than evidence. Systematic monitoring identifies these patterns before they destroy more families. Her expertise ensured that oversight mechanisms addressed subtle discrimination rather than just obvious misconduct. Nancy Stevens' Court Administration Office received federal funding to provide discrimination documentation training throughout state court systems, using her experience exposing Crawford's bias as a model for how court personnel could protect civil rights through institutional accountability. Court staff see everything that happens in judicial proceedings, Stevens explained during national training conferences. We know which judges apply different standards, which attorneys coordinate with biased judges, and which families are being treated unfairly. Training and protection for whistleblowers turns court personnel into civil rights protectors rather than passive enablers. The institutional approach recognized that ending judicial discrimination required changing systems rather than just individual behavior. Judge Crawford had been convicted on federal civil rights charges and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for judicial discrimination, establishing precedent that biased judges faced serious criminal consequences equivalent to other government officials who violated civil rights. Judge Crawford's systematic discrimination destroyed families and traumatized children to serve personal racial hierarchy, federal judge Sarah Kim stated during sentencing. His abuse of judicial authority demands severe punishment that protects future families from similar violations and deters other judges from comparable misconduct. The harsh sentence sent clear messages throughout the judicial system that discrimination carried career-ending and freedom-threatening consequences. The 37 families whose custody cases have been decided through Crawford's racial bias receive comprehensive remediation, overturned custody orders, family reunification services, financial compensation for legal costs and trauma counseling, and priority consideration for federal victim assistance programs. Dr. Torres' Psychological Evaluation Office was restructured to eliminate pressure for biased assessments, with federal oversight ensuring that child welfare evaluations reflected evidence rather than judicial preferences. Data analysis 12 months into the reforms showed remarkable improvements. Discriminatory custody patterns have been eliminated entirely, with custody awards now reflecting evidence and child welfare rather than racial assumptions. Family satisfaction with court proceedings increased significantly, while appeals of custody decisions decreased as parents trusted that decisions reflected fair consideration rather than predetermined bias. Constitutional compliance enhanced rather than hindered effective family court operations, Chief Judge Morrison acknowledged during judicial administration conferences. When decisions are based on evidence and child welfare rather than racial assumptions, families trust the system and children benefit from placements that actually serve their needs. The statistical validation demonstrated that civil rights protection and effective child welfare were complementary rather than competing values. 14 months after Judge Crawford's arrest in his own courtroom, Director Vanessa Price returned to Riverside County for the inaugural Family Justice and Constitutional Protection Day, a celebration of the comprehensive reforms that had transformed local family courts from institutions of discrimination into models of equitable child welfare protection. The transformation was evident throughout the courthouse complex. Waiting areas that had previously felt hostile to minority families now displayed constitutional rights information, bias reporting procedures, and family support resources. Courtrooms that had once echoed with discriminatory reasoning now featured transparent decision-making processes where evidence determined outcomes rather than racial assumptions. Chief Judge Morrison greeted Price with visible pride in the institutional change her leadership had guided under federal oversight. Director Price, I want to show you what constitutional family court operations look like when civil rights protection is embedded in every aspect of judicial decision-making. She displayed comprehensive accountability data that had become publicly available through monthly transparency reports, reforms that allowed families, attorneys, and oversight bodies to monitor whether judges were applying custody standards equitably. The data showed complete elimination of the racial disparities that had characterized Crawford's discriminatory tenure. When family courts operate constitutionally, every outcome improves, Morrison explained. Children remain with qualified parents regardless of race. Families trust judicial decisions, and child welfare improves because placements reflect evidence rather than bias. Attorney Chong, whose initial complaint had triggered Price's investigation, now directed the state's Family Court Accountability Office, training judges nationwide in recognizing and preventing discriminatory decision-making. Judge Crawford's prosecution changed everything, Chong told visiting legal professionals from other states. Judges now understand that systematic discrimination triggers federal prosecution rather than professional protection. Civil rights compliance isn't optional courtesy. It's constitutional requirement that federal law enforces through criminal penalties. Her transformation from frustrated advocate to institutional reformer demonstrated how accountability could empower those who had been fighting discrimination without authority to address it effectively. Nancy Stevens, promoted to federal court administration specialist, had developed the documentation systems that made judicial discrimination visible and actionable rather than hidden behind claims of discretionary authority. Crawford's conviction proved that court personnel have obligation to document and report discriminatory behavior rather than enabling it through silence. Stevens explained to administrative training conferences. Protecting civil rights requires institutional courage, not just individual integrity. The 23 families whose children had been removed through Crawford's racial bias had been reunified through comprehensive federal intervention, with psychological support services addressing trauma caused by judicial discrimination. Marcus Williams, whose custody had been transferred to his white ex-husband despite her superior qualifications, spoke at the commemoration event. "My daughter was separated from me for 8 months because Judge Crawford decided that black mothers don't deserve equal treatment. Director Price's investigation gave us back our family and showed that even judges face consequences when they violate civil rights." Her testimony demonstrated that accountability meant more than punishment. It required restoration for victims whose lives had been damaged by institutional discrimination. The Federal Judicial Accountability Office had expanded Riverside's protocols to monitor family court systems in 37 states, using statistical analysis to identify discriminatory patterns before they escalated to systematic family destruction. Judge Crawford, meanwhile, had served 2 years of his 8-year federal sentence when he died by suicide in federal prison. His suicide note expressing no remorse for discriminating against families, but only anger about federal prosecution that had destroyed his judicial career. His death was covered extensively in legal publications as demonstration of how judicial discrimination could destroy perpetrators as well as victims, reinforcing deterrent effects for other judges who might consider whether racial bias was worth personal and professional risks. On Price's final evening in Riverside, she met with families whose courage in challenging Crawford's discrimination had made federal accountability possible despite institutional resistance and judicial intimidation. "You proved that individual families can challenge systematic judicial corruption when they have evidence, persistence, and federal support," Price told them during an informal gathering at the courthouse. Reverend Jackson spoke for the community. "Director Price, you showed us that civil rights protection isn't just legal theory. It's practical reality when federal authorities have integrity to enforce constitutional law against powerful officials who think their positions make them untouchable." As Price returned to her federal duties, she carried evidence that American judicial institutions could evolve beyond their discriminatory history when leadership prioritized constitutional compliance over institutional self-protection. Riverside County now stood as proof that family courts could operate without racial bias while improving rather than hindering child welfare outcomes, that judicial accountability enhanced rather than threatened legitimate judicial independence, and that federal civil rights enforcement could reform state court systems without destroying their effectiveness. Most importantly, The family court system demonstrated that transformation required both removing individual discriminatory judges and building systems that prevented bias, protected victims, and prioritized children's welfare over judges' personal prejudices. The FBI director, who had been dismissed as an unfit mother, now left behind institutions where fitness was determined by evidence rather than race, where judicial authority served constitutional protection rather than personal bias, and where family courts protected all children rather than serving judicial prejudice disguised as child welfare. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.